Every human being who has ever lived has experienced the world from behind a pair of eyes. You are born into a body, a name, a nationality, a family, a story, and from the very beginning, the world teaches you something that feels completely obvious that you are separate from everything else, separate from other people, separate from nature, separate from the universe itself. You are you, and everything else is other. It's such a natural assumption, most of us never question it. But there's something strange about separation. The deeper we examine reality, the harder it becomes to clearly define where anything actually ends. Your body, for example, feels permanent, but nearly every atom inside it will eventually be replaced. The air you breathe was inside someone else moments ago. The food you eat becomes your cells. The water in your body may once have passed through oceans, clouds, dinosaurs, ancient forests. Even the boundaries of the human body become difficult to define. You are carrying trillions of bacteria inside you right now, many of which are necessary for your survival. So, where exactly does you begin, and where exactly does not you end? Congratulations, we're less than 3 minutes in, and your sense of identity is already under review. And the deeper science looks into reality, the stranger things become. Matter dissolves into atoms, atoms dissolve into particles, particles begin behaving like probabilities, space and time bend, cause and effect become less intuitive, and suddenly the universe starts looking less like a giant machine and more like something profoundly interconnected. Not necessarily magical, not necessarily supernatural, just interconnected. And that raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if separation is not ultimately reality, but a kind of experience, a perspective, an illusion convincing enough that humanity built entire civilizations around it? For thousands of years, philosophers, mystics, spiritual traditions, and religious systems have repeatedly arrived at a similar conclusion that beneath the apparent chaos of the universe, everything may ultimately emerge from a single source, a deeper unity, a hidden oneness. And few modern spiritual works state that idea more directly than the law of one. According to the material, you are everything, every being, every emotion, every event, every situation. You are unity. You are infinity. You are love light, light love. You are. It's a radical idea, not merely that all life is connected, but that separation itself may only be temporary, that behind every person, every creature, every star, every moment of suffering and joy, there is ultimately only one consciousness experiencing itself from countless different perspectives. Now, whether that idea is literally true, symbolically true, or completely wrong, is something each person must decide for themselves. But before we can even explore that possibility, we first need to understand something else: what science actually knows about the universe, and perhaps more importantly, what it still doesn't. To understand why the idea of oneness has fascinated humanity for thousands of years, we first need to begin somewhere more concrete: science. Because despite all the mystery surrounding existence, modern science has accomplished something extraordinary. Human beings, tiny biological organisms standing on a rock orbiting a star, somehow learned how to measure the universe itself. We discovered the age of the Earth, the motion of the planets, the life cycle of stars, the structure of atoms, the behavior of light, the curvature of space time. We split the atom, mapped the genome, walked on the moon, supposedly, built machines capable of detecting gravitational waves caused by black holes colliding billions of light years away, which is honestly an absurd level of progress for a species that still argues on the internet about whether the Earth is flat. And the deeper science looked, the more ordered the universe appeared to be. Reality operates according to patterns, predictable laws, mathematical relationships, consistent behaviors. Gravity behaves the same way here as it does in distant galaxies. Light moves at a measurable speed. Energy transforms according to fixed principles. Matter interacts through forces that can be described with astonishing precision. The universe is not random chaos, at least, not entirely. Modern physics tells us that everything we see around us, stars, oceans, trees, human beings, cities, is constructed from the same underlying ingredients: atoms. And those atoms themselves are built from even smaller particles: protons, electrons, neutrons, quarks. The human body, despite feeling separate and personal, is ultimately composed of the same material as collapsing stars, distant nebulae, and ancient galaxies. In a very literal scientific sense, you are made of cosmic debris. The iron in your blood was forged inside stars. The calcium in your bones originated in stellar explosions. The oxygen you breathe was produced through nuclear fusion billions of years ago. As astronomer Carl Sagan famously said, we are made of star stuff. And remarkably, that isn't poetry, it's physics. The universe also appears deeply interconnected through systems. Nothing truly exists in isolation. Forests depend on fungal networks beneath the soil. Animals depend on ecosystems. Human civilization depends on oceans, insects, bacteria, climate stability, agriculture, and invisible atmospheric balances most people never think about. Even your own body is less independent than it seems. Trillions of microorganisms live inside you right now. Many are essential for digestion, immunity, and survival. In fact, from a biological perspective, you are less like a singular organism and more like a walking ecosystem negotiating a fragile peace treaty. Your stomach is essentially hosting the microbial version of the United Nations. And perhaps most fascinating of all, the universe is understandable, at least partially. Mathematics, abstract symbols created inside the human mind, somehow describe the behavior of reality itself. Equations predict eclipses, quantum mechanics predicts particle behavior, relativity predicts gravitational distortion. Again and again, the cosmos behaves in a way that can be mapped, modeled, and anticipated, which raises a profound question. Why? Why should reality obey elegant mathematical laws at all? Why should consciousness emerge from matter? Why should the universe be comprehensible to tiny self aware creatures living on a single planet? Science can describe how many things happen, but eventually, every explanation encounters a deeper mystery beneath it. Why do the laws themselves exist? Why is there something rather than nothing? Why does the universe appear structured instead of chaotic? And perhaps strangest of all, why does a universe made of apparently unconscious particles produce beings capable of wondering about their own existence in the first place? The more humanity learned about reality, the more astonishing reality became. But despite all of our discoveries, science has also revealed something deeply humbling. We may understand far less about the universe than we once believed. For centuries, science gave humanity a growing sense of certainty. Each new discovery seemed to pull another veil away from reality. Disease could be explained, planetary motion could be predicted, electricity could be harnessed, matter itself could be broken apart and studied. And for a while, it genuinely appeared as though humanity might eventually explain everything. That the universe was ultimately a machine. Complex, yes, but fully understandable. Then, the deeper we looked, the stranger reality became, because modern science has uncovered an uncomfortable truth. We do not fully understand the universe we live in, not even close. In fact, according to current cosmological models, everything human beings can directly observe stars, planets, galaxies, gas clouds, black holes, oceans, trees, your body, the screen accounts for only about 5% of the known universe. The remaining 95% appears to consist of something science still cannot directly identify. Roughly 27% is called dark matter, and about 68% is called dark energy. Those names may sound dramatic, but they're essentially placeholders. Scientific terms meaning something is clearly affecting the universe, but we don't know yet what it is. Dark matter appears to exert gravitational influence on galaxies. Without it, galaxies should spin apart far too quickly to remain stable. Something invisible seems to be holding them together. Dark energy is even stranger. Observations suggest the expansion of the universe is accelerating over time, as though space itself is being pushed outward by some unknown force. And despite decades of research, we still do not know what dark energy actually is. Humanity basically discovered that most of the universe is invisible and responded by naming it dark something. Then there are black holes, objects so dense that gravity bends space time itself. According to Einstein's equations, when enough mass collapses into a sufficiently small region, it creates a point where known physics begins to break down. A singularity, a place where our mathematical models stop functioning properly. Space and time themselves appear to lose meaning. And the strangest part? Black holes were first discovered not through telescopes, but through mathematics. The equations predicted something reality had not yet revealed, which is both inspiring and mildly terrifying. because it suggests the universe may obey principles deeper than human intuition. Then comes quantum mechanics, the branch of physics governing the behavior of subatomic particles. And this is where reality begins behaving in ways that sound almost fictional. Particles can exist in probabilistic states. Light behaves as both particle and wave. Quantum fields fluctuate constantly even in empty space. And perhaps most famously, certain experiments suggest that observing a system affects its measurable outcome. Now, this is often exaggerated online into human consciousness magically creates reality. That is not what mainstream physics says. But even physicists themselves acknowledge that quantum mechanics challenges ordinary assumptions about objectivity, locality, and measurement. As physicist Richard Feynman once admitted, I think I can safely say that nobody understands quantum mechanics. And then there is consciousness itself, perhaps the greatest mystery of all. Science can map brain activity, measure electrical signals, observe neural networks firing, but none of this fully explains subjective experience. Why does awareness exist at all? Why should matter become conscious? How does electrochemical activity inside the brain produce love, fear, music, grief, the color red, the feeling of being alive? This is sometimes called the hard problem of consciousness. Not how does the brain process information, but why is there an inner experience happening at all? And despite enormous scientific progress, there is still no universally accepted explanation. Then there's a question sitting beneath every other question. Why does anything exist at all? Why are there laws of physics at all? Why should mathematics describe reality so elegantly? Why does the universe appear fine tuned in ways that allow matter, stars, chemistry, and eventually life to emerge? Science can trace the universe backward toward the Big Bang. But what caused the Big Bang? What existed before it? Was there even a before? No one truly knows. And this is important to understand. Not because science is failing, but because reality itself may be far stranger, deeper, and more mysterious than human beings once assumed. The modern scientific worldview is not a story of certainty. It is increasingly a story of profound mystery, a realization that the closer we move toward the foundations of existence, the more the universe begins slipping beyond ordinary intuition. And strangely enough, it is precisely at the edge of those mysteries where many people begin asking the very old question: what if reality is not fundamentally separate after all? Now, to be clear, science has not concluded that everything is one. No major scientific institution is officially endorsing cosmic unity consciousness anytime soon. MIT is not currently handing out diplomas in universal oneness engineering. But while science does not prove the idea, some discoveries have revealed a universe that appears far more interconnected than human intuition once assumed. And in certain areas, the concept of absolute separation begins looking surprisingly fragile. One example comes from quantum physics. In 1935, physicists Albert Einstein, Boris Podolsky, and Nathan Rosen described a phenomenon that later became known as quantum entanglement. Under certain conditions, two particles can become linked in such a way that measuring one instantly correlates with the state of the other, even across enormous distances. Einstein famously disliked the implication so much, he referred to it as spooky action at a distance. You may have heard this before. Because according to ordinary intuition, objects separated by vast space should behave independently, and yet experiments repeatedly confirmed entanglement appears to be real. Now, this does not mean everything is spiritually connected through quantum magic. The internet has already done enough damage there. But it does suggest that reality at fundamental levels may not behave according to the neat separations human beings naturally imagine. Then there's the structure of matter itself. Everything around you, your body, trees, animals, oceans, mountains, distant stars, is constructed from the same fundamental particles and fields. The universe is not made from separate categories of substance. It is one continuous cosmic process taking different forms. The carbon in your cells may once have existed inside exploding stars. The atoms in your body were recycled through ancient planets, oceans, atmospheres, and living organisms across billions of years. In a literal physical sense, you are not separate from the universe. You are an activity within it, a temporary arrangement of cosmic material becoming self aware. And biology reveals similar patterns of interconnectedness. Forests communicate through underground fungal networks, sometimes called the wood wide web. Trees exchange nutrients warn neighboring plants about dangers, participate in cooperative systems once thought impossible. Coral reefs function as independent living networks. Bee populations influence global agriculture. Tiny plankton in Earth's oceans help regulate planetary oxygen production. Life does not emerge through isolated independence. It emerges through relationship, through systems nested inside systems. Even human beings themselves are profoundly interconnected psychologically. Emotions spread socially, trauma passes through generations, ideas replicate across cultures. Entire populations can be influenced by collective fear, hope, anger, or belief. And increasingly, neuroscientists are discovering that human brains are deeply relational. Mirror neurons, for example, activate both when a person performs an action and when they observe someone else performing that same action. In some sense, the brain partially experiences others internally, which may help explain empathy itself. Why humans instinctively wince when witnessing pain, why loneliness affects physical health, why social rejection activates brain regions similar to physical injury. The human nervous system appears designed not merely for survival, but for connection. And perhaps most profound of all, the closer science examines reality, the less solid and isolated things appear to become. Atoms are mostly empty space. Particles blur into probability. Matter and energy become interchangeable. E equals mc squared. Time bends relative to motion and gravity. The observer becomes difficult to fully remove from observation. At the deepest levels, the universe begins looking less like separate objects and more like relationships, processes, fields interacting with fields, a continuous unfolding. Again, none of this proves a philosophical or spiritual claim that all is one, but it does create an interesting realization. Many assumptions about separation that once seemed obvious no longer appear quite absolute. And long before particle accelerators, quantum theory, or modern cosmology, human beings across vastly different civilizations had already begun arriving at a remarkably similar intuition that beneath the apparent fragmentation of life, there may exist a deeper unity connecting everything. Long before modern physics, before telescopes, before particle accelerators, before neuroscience, human beings were already asking one of the oldest questions imaginable: what is the true nature of reality? And remarkably, cultures separated by oceans, languages, and centuries often arrived at strangely similar conclusions that beneath the apparent diversity of life, there exists some kind of underlying unity. In ancient India, the philosophical traditions that would later influence Hinduism spoke of Brahman, an ultimate universal consciousness underlying all existence. The individual self, or Atman, was often described not as separate from the greater reality, but as an expression of it, a wave arising from a much larger ocean. In Buddhism, many teachings emphasize the illusion of a fixed, isolated self. Everything exists through interdependence. Nothing arises independently. The idea of dependent origination proposed that all phenomena emerge through relationships and conditions, woven together in an inseparable web of causation. In ancient Taoist philosophy, the Tao is described as the underlying flow from which all existence emerges, not a distant God controlling reality from outside, but the living processes through which reality unfolds. Even many indigenous traditions viewed humanity not as separate from nature, but as participating within a living, interconnected world. Animals, rivers, forests, sky, earth, not resources, but relatives. And throughout history, mystics across many different religions repeatedly described experiences that sound remarkably similar. Moments in which the ordinary boundaries of identity seem to dissolve. Experiences of overwhelming unity, connection, timelessness, a sense that consciousness itself extended beyond the isolated self. And what makes this especially interesting is that many of these traditions develop independently. Different languages, different continents, different eras. Yet again and again, human beings seem drawn toward the intuition that separation might not be ultimate reality. Even some modern thinkers and physicists began cautiously entertaining similar philosophical questions. Physicist Erwin Schrödinger, one of the founders of quantum mechanics, wrote, "The total number of minds in the universe is one." Meanwhile, astronomer Carl Sagan reflected on humanity this way: we are a way for the cosmos to know itself. Not necessarily mystical claims, but deeply suggestive ones. The idea that consciousness may not be as isolated as it appears, that human beings may not stand apart from the universe, but emerge from it in the same way branches emerge from a tree. And then in the early 1980s, a channeled work called The Law of One appeared and presented perhaps one of the most direct and uncompromising versions of the idea ever recorded. Its central claim was simple, radical, but simple, that all things, all beings, all matter, all consciousness, all experiences are ultimately expressions of one infinite reality, one consciousness, one source, one being experiencing itself through countless forms. The material summarized this idea in a phrase repeated throughout the sessions: all is one. Not metaphorically, literally. According to the material, every person you meet, every life form, every act of kindness, every act of cruelty, every joy, and every tragedy is ultimately occurring within a single unified consciousness exploring itself from a different perspective. And if true, that would completely transform the way we think about identity, conflict, morality, death, forgiveness, and even what it means to be a human. Because under that framework, there are not truly others, only different versions of the same being, temporarily forgetting what it is. So, what exactly does the law of one mean when it says all is one? At first glance, the phrase can sound poetic, abstract, maybe even meaningless. The kind of thing someone says moments before trying to sell crystals in a parking lot. But the material presents the idea in a surprisingly structured and philosophical way. According to the law of one, the universe is not fundamentally composed of separate beings interacting with one another. Instead, there is only one infinite consciousness, one intelligent reality, one source. And everything that exists, matter, energy, space, time, stars, planets, animals, human beings, are expressions of that single source exploring itself through countless perspectives. In other words, you are not merely in the universe, you are the universe, experiencing itself as a person. The material often refers to the source as the one infinite creator. But importantly, the concept is not presented as a traditional religious deity sitting somewhere outside creation, not a cosmic ruler watching reality from a distance. Instead, creation itself is the creator, the stars, the galaxies, the laws of physics, consciousness, life, all of it. According to Ra, all things are one, that there is no polarity, no right or wrong, no disharmony, but only identity. All is one. And that one is love, light, light, love, the infinite creator. Now, the material does not claim individuality is fake in the everyday sense. You still experience yourself as a distinct person. You have memories, preferences, fears, relationships, a personality. The law of one would describe individuality as real, but temporary, like a character being played by a deeper consciousness, or waves appearing separate on the surface of an ocean while remaining inseparable beneath it. And according to the material, the purpose of existence is experience itself. The one infinite creator knows itself through differentiation, through billions of perspectives, through joy and suffering, love and fear, creation and destruction, birth and death. Every life becomes a vantage point through which consciousness explores possibility. Even limitation itself becomes meaningful, because according to the law of one, forgetting our unity is part of the experience. Ra repeatedly describes incarnation into physical reality as entering a kind of veil, a condition in which beings temporarily forget their deeper nature, forget their connection to one another, forget their origin. Why? Because without that forgetting, choice loses meaning. If every human being directly perceived universal unity at all times, there would be little conflict, little confusion, little uncertainty, but also far less growth. The material suggests physical existence functions almost like a school for consciousness, a place where beings gradually learn through relationships, through suffering, through compassion, through mistakes, through forgiveness, through experience itself. And central to that journey is a fundamental choice. Will consciousness move toward love and unity, or towards control and separation? The law of one describes these as service to others and service to self, not merely moral categories, but orientations of consciousness itself. One path increasingly recognizes interconnectedness, the other increasingly reinforces separation. And according to the material, much of human suffering emerges from the illusion that we are disconnected from one another, that we are isolated selves competing for survival inside an indifferent universe. But if all consciousness ultimately shares the same source, then harming others becomes more complicated. Because under this framework, there are no truly separate others to harm. Ross states this directly. Each entity contains within it all of the densities and subdensities of the octave, so that in each entity, no matter whither its choices lead to it, Its great internal blueprint is one with all others. Thusly, its experiences will fall into the patterns of the journey back to the original logos. This is done through free will, but the materials from which choices can be made are one blueprint. And elsewhere, you are everything, every being, every emotion, every event, every situation. You are unity. You are infinity. You are love, light, light, love. You are. This idea sits at the absolute center of the entire material. Not UFOs, not pyramids, not densities, not metaphysics. Unity. Everything else branches outward from that single premise that beneath the appearance of multiplicity, existence is one infinite consciousness, learning about itself through experience. And if that perspective is even partially true, then the human idea of separation may not simply be incomplete. It may be the central illusion around which civilization itself has been built. If the central idea of the law of one is true, or even partially true, then one of the biggest consequences is this: human beings may be living inside a psychological illusion of separation. Not an illusion in the sense that the world is fake. Pain feels real, loss feels real, individual lives clearly exist. But perhaps the degree to which we perceive ourselves as isolated from one another is distorted. Because from the moment we are born, human identity is built through separation. My body, my beliefs, my family, my religion, my country, my success, my suffering. The ego organizes reality through categories and boundaries, and to some extent, that's necessary. You cannot function in physical reality without a sense of self. But problems begin when identity becomes absolute, when the mind stops seeing perspectives and starts seeing enemies. History is filled with examples of what happens when human beings become completely identified with separation. Wars, genocide, racism, religious hatred, political fanaticism, exploitation. Entire civilizations built around the idea that some groups matter more than others, that some lives are inherently separate from our own. And psychologically, human beings seem deeply conditioned toward tribal thinking. The brain constantly divides reality into us and them, friend and enemy, insider and outsider. In evolutionary terms, this probably helped early humans survive. But in the modern world, those same instincts can scale into enormous suffering. A disagreement becomes dehumanization, a border becomes hatred, an ideology becomes justification for cruelty. And perhaps most tragically, people often inflict the greatest harm when they no longer perceive others as fundamentally connected to themselves. The law of one suggests this separation is not ultimate truth, but a temporary condition of consciousness, a forgetting. And strangely enough, modern psychology hints at similar patterns. Studies consistently show that human beings suffer profoundly from isolation. Loneliness increases stress hormones, weakens immune function, raises mortality risk. Social rejection activates some of the same neural pathways associated with physical pain. The nervous system appears to interpret disconnection as danger. Why? Why should emotional isolation affect the body so deeply? Why are human beings so psychologically dependent on connection? And perhaps more importantly, why does empathy exist at all? Why do people cry while watching strangers suffer? Why does compassion feel so meaningful? Why does helping others often improve psychological well being? From a purely survival based perspective, extreme self interest might seem more efficient. And yet, human beings repeatedly risk themselves for others. Parents sacrifice for children, strangers rescue strangers. People donate time, energy, and resources to individuals they will never meet. Even forgiveness itself is strange, because forgiveness often feels less like surrender and more like liberation, as though resentment binds the one holding it. And this is where the law of one becomes deeply personal, because under its framework, every act of hatred ultimately becomes self directed. Every cruelty is committed against another expression of the same consciousness. Every kindness is extended to the self in another form. Ra expresses this idea very directly. To serve one is to serve all. And that changes morality completely. Compassion is no longer merely ethical behavior, it becomes alignment with reality itself. The more consciousness recognizes unity, the more naturally empathy emerges. Not because of rules, not because of punishment, not because religion demands it, but because separation itself begins dissolving. And perhaps this is why so many human beings describe moments in life where the illusion briefly weakens. During deep meditation, near death experiences, psychedelic states, profound love, parenthood, music, trauma, nature. Moments where the ordinary boundaries of identity suddenly feel less solid. where people describe sensing connection, unity, timelessness, or overwhelming compassion. Again, none of this proves the law of one, but it may explain why the idea continues resurfacing across cultures and generations. Because somewhere beneath the surface of ordinary life, many people seem to intuitively feel that separation is incomplete, that consciousness itself may extend beyond the isolated ego. And if humanity truly internalized that idea, civilization might begin functioning very differently, because it becomes much harder to hate another person once you genuinely begin seeing them as another version of yourself. So, what happens if the central idea of the law of one is actually true, or at least closer to the truth than humanity currently understands? What changes? Because ultimately, a philosophy only matters if it affects the way people live. And the implication of oneness would be enormous, not politically, not ideologically, existentially. Because if all consciousness is fundamentally connected, then the way we treat one another may matter far more deeply than we realize. Under the law of one framework, every interaction becomes meaningful. Every act of kindness, every cruelty, every lie, every moment of compassion. Not because some external authority is keeping score, but because consciousness is interacting with itself. The material repeatedly suggests that spiritual evolution is not primarily about power, knowledge, or status. It is about learning love, learning understanding, learning compassion, learning balance, learning how to recognize yourself in others. And perhaps that sounds simplistic at first, until you actually try doing it. Because loving people conditionally is easy. Loving people who agree with you, who validate you, who benefit you, requires very little transformation. But loving difficult people, forgiving people, seeing humanity inside those you dislike, that's much harder. Humanity collectively looked at love one another and said, best we can do is arguing in the comment sections. The law of one suggests that much of human suffering emerges from identification with separation, ego, fear, control, comparison, division, the constant psychological reinforcement of me versus them. And according to the material, awakening spiritually is less about gaining something new and more about remembering something ancient, remembering connection, remembering unity, remembering that beneath personality, history, and identity, other people may not be as separate from you as they appear. Even self forgiveness becomes important under this framework, because many people extend compassion outward more easily than inward. They carry guilt for years, hatred toward themselves, regret, shame, but if all consciousness is ultimately part of one being, then self hatred also becomes another form of separation. Ra repeatedly emphasizes the importance of acceptance. Each entity is the creator, not just spiritually enlightened people, not saints, not gurus, everyone. The anxious person, the grieving person, the addict, the arrogant person, the person who failed, the person trying again. All expressions of the same source at different stages of remembering. And importantly, the law of one does not require passive acceptance of harmful behavior. Unity does not mean becoming incapable of discernment. Boundaries still matter, justice still matters, protection still matters. But hatred itself begins looking different. Because if another person acts from ignorance, fear, trauma, or separation, then cruelty may reflect unconsciousness more than inherent evil. That does not excuse harm, but it changes how harm is understood. And perhaps one of the deepest implications of all is what this idea means for death. Because if consciousness is fundamentally one, then death may not represent annihilation, only transition, a wave returning to the ocean it temporarily appeared separate from. This idea appears across countless spiritual traditions and sits at the center of the law of one cosmology, that consciousness evolves, continues, learns, that existence itself may be far larger than one lifetime. Now, again, none of this can currently be proven scientifically. The goal here is simply to seriously consider the possibility, to ask, what if separation is not the final truth of reality? What if humanity has mistaken individuality for isolation? And what if many of the problems defining civilization, violence, greed, exploitation, hatred, alienation, partly emerge from forgetting our connection to one another? Because if people genuinely experience others as extensions of themselves, the world might begin changing in ways that feel almost impossible today. Not overnight, not perfectly, but fundamentally. Maybe the strangest part of all of this is that humanity has spent centuries trying to understand the universe by dividing it into smaller and smaller pieces: atoms, particles, forces, genes, neurons. separating reality in order to understand it. And that approach has revealed extraordinary truths. But perhaps somewhere along the way, we also began believing that separation itself was the truth. That we are isolated minds inside accidental bodies in an indifferent universe. And maybe that belief has shaped civilization more than we realize. Because when human beings truly see themselves as separate, fear becomes easier, greed becomes easier, cruelty becomes easier. Other people become abstractions, competitors, enemies, statistics. But if the central idea of the law of one is even partially correct, then every person you encounter may be far more connected to you than they appear. The stranger on the street, the person you love, the person you fear, the person you disagree with, the person you envy, the person you became years ago. All expressions of the same deeper reality, temporary perspectives within something larger. And maybe that's why moments of genuine connection feel so powerful, why compassion feels so meaningful, why forgiveness feels liberating, why loneliness hurts so deeply, why love can completely reorganize a human life. Perhaps those experiences momentarily weaken the illusion of separation, not eliminating individuality, but revealing that individuality may exist within unity rather than apart from it. The law of one presents this idea in the simplest possible way. All things, all life, all of the creation is part of one original thought, a single consciousness exploring itself through infinite forms. Now, whether that idea is metaphysically true, symbolically true, or simply a beautiful philosophical lens, is something each person must decide for themselves. But at minimum, it raises an important question. What kind of world would humanity create if people genuinely saw each other as connected? Not politically connected, not technologically connected, existentially connected. What if compassion is not weakness, but clarity? What if empathy is not merely emotion, but perception? And what if the separation we experience every day is real enough to experience, but not ultimate enough to define reality? Maybe the universe is not made of disconnected things after all. Maybe it is one unfolding process, temporarily appearing as many. One consciousness looking out through billions of different eyes, and perhaps somewhere beneath all of the noise of modern life, beneath identity, fear, ambition, conflict, and distraction, human beings have always sensed this. A quiet intuition that behind the apparent fragmentation of existence, there is still something whole, something shared, something fundamentally one. Thank you for watching or listening. I wish you all love, light, peace, and joy. Take care.